Dignity of life and gun policy. For those that are here present, continue to share in your dinner. We welcome those who are joining us live stream. And after the keynote address, there'll be a time for questions. And the text number to text your question for those that are live streaming is 703-679-8606. So for those live streaming, I'm going to say that one more time. To text your questions, 703-679-8606. I want to thank the members of the Peace and Justice Commission who join me in providing this conference each year. Father Jack O'Hara, Father Mike Bazan, Amy McIntyre from the Family Life Office, Eric Giblin, a Nativity parishioner and high school administrator, Carla Walsh, who's the coordinator of the office in our Diocese for Catholic Relief Services, Catholic Campaign for Human Development, and Social Justice. I also want to thank those who helped with the planning of the conference tonight. Allison Fram and Mary Castellano from Nativity Parish. Allison is the Director of Young Adult, Family, and Social Action Ministry, and Mary is our social media coordinator. From the Diocesan Office of Young Adult and Youth Ministry, Kevin Boley, assisted by Cecilia Hassenmeyer. From the Communications Office, Diana Snyder. From the Multicultural Office, Bridget Wilson and Fatima Solis. So thank all of you for all the hard work in putting on the conference tonight. We also have participants who have brought materials. Emily Jackson from the Virginia Catholic Conference and Bob Moore from Pax Christi and St. John Newman Parish, and they have materials on the table in front of the center. Having a discussion on gun policy can be a little difficult. Gun violence has been called a public health crisis. Since Columbine 25 years ago, 400,000 children have been impacted by school shootings, and they live with profound emotional impact and trauma from that experience. And firearm injuries are the leading cause of death among children and teenagers in our country. It's for this reason that we wanted to have this conference tonight. And it's this reason that the bishop is with us to address this issue. We're very happy to have Michael Rourke as our keynote address and to bring us up to current issues, the latest data, and how the bishops of our country have been advocating for gun reform. Michael is the director of the Office of Domestic Justice and Human Development at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. In this role, Michael works with a team of policy advisors to support the bishops in engaging on a wide range of domestic policy issues, including gun violence. He joined the Bishops' Conference in 2016 and has served as the Domestic Policy Director since 2020. He is a lawyer, and before going to the conference, he practiced law at a law firm and clerked for a judge in Washington, D.C. He received his doctorate of law from Georgetown University and his Bachelor of Arts from Harvard. He and his wife, Ann, live in Maryland. They have 2 children, the oldest in kindergarten, the youngest 2.5. So, Michael, we welcome you to the Catholic Diocese of Arlington tonight to our Peace and Justice Conference.
Well, thank you, Monsignor, for that kind welcome. Thank you, Bishop Burbidge. Thank you, all of you, for being here on a Saturday evening to talk about such an important topic. It's wonderful for me to be back in the Diocese of Arlington. When my wife and I first got married, we lived in Arlington in the Clarendon area. We were at St. Charles Borromeo and going back and forth with St. Matthew's Cathedral, where we met and where we used to sing in the choir. So crossing the bridge into Northern Virginia is a happy occasion for me, so I'm really pleased to be with you. I was a little bit intimidated to give this talk after just such a gorgeous liturgy and a delicious dinner, but then I thought, in the spirit of Mary and Martha, you've already had the better part. So if my talk is a dud, you've already had a great evening, and there's really nothing I can do to undermine that. So let's get started. The dignity of life and gun policy. So sort of a preview of coming attractions. These are all of the gun policies that the USCCB has supported over the years. And I'm sort of showing you this. The purpose of my talk is to really give you a sense of the Catholic social teaching that underlies this, to show that these are prudential judgments to support these, that they're reasonable, and to kind of get you thinking along those lines. So where are we going? I'm going to start with some data, with some facts on the ground, and then I'm going to take a long walk through Catholic social teaching that's relevant to this issue. The Catechism, the Compendium. Just by a show of hands, how many people know about the Compendium of the Social Doctrine? A couple hands? Okay, good. So that's from the Vatican, from Justice and Peace there, kind of tracks the Catechism and then goes in some more depth. So we'll look at that as well. And then we'll hit some other Vatican documents, Pope Francis, and then the American bishops. So let's just start kind of with the facts. In 2023, 46,728 people died from firearm-related deaths. It sort of peaked in 2021, and so it has fallen the second year in a row. It is worth tracking kind of how this moves now that we're moving out of COVID. But it's still among the highest ever recorded. 27,300 died by firearm-related suicide. That's the highest number. So that's 58%. It used to be kind of 2/3 were suicides. So when we're talking about gun violence and gun-related deaths, we're not just talking about homicide. We're talking about suicide, and actually a majority suicide in the way that this is tracked. As Monsignor mentioned, 4,455 children and teens died by firearm. That was in 2023, and it is the leading cause of death for children and teens 1 through 19. And the overall gun death rate among youth doubled from 2013 to 2022. So this is I think we all agree, an incredibly important issue, and one that we all have to kind of engage in one way or another. And just to give you sort of that sense, the longitudinal sense of how this has been going, so you can kind of see how well can you see it there. So just starting in 1968, when they're tracking this, you're talking about around 20,000 gun-related deaths, and then we wound up with 46,000. You can see how the murder rate has gone up and down. You see that spike in the early 90s. That's sort of related to the crack cocaine epidemic and gun violence at that time. It takes a big drop mid to late 90s. But it started spiking again. You see the ramp up in 15, 16, 20, and then the pandemic. But then it's sort of been falling as we've emerged out of the pandemic. Suicide, you notice, it's gone up, and it really starts climbing at a steeper rate in around sort of between 2004 and 2008. It keeps climbing during the pandemic, but it's sort of on that trajectory even before the pandemic. And this is just for you statistics nerds out there. So this is the This would be the gun deaths per 100,000. So you're comparing apples to apples, because remember the population is growing over that time from 1968 to the present. So you can see here, again, the suicide rate now is about as high as it's ever been. 1976 was as high as it was for gun-related suicides. For homicide, it spent a long time after dropping in the late 90s, kind of at a pretty steady level, and then it ramped up again, peaking during the pandemic, and then has sort of fallen a bit since then. And U.S. gun death rates vary widely by state. So this is the darker states have the higher gun deaths per 100,000, and the lighter states have the lower rates. So you can see there's variance across the country. Most gun homicides are not mass shootings. Mass shootings get a lot of the attention. But mass shootings are also kind of hard to track. It's hard to define. So this is the FBI's statistics, and it's probably hard to read that at the bottom, but it's their active shooter incidents defined as one or more individuals actively engaging in killing or attempting to kill people in a populated area. So you can see it's kind of going up there. It's also acknowledged that there's a lot of variance in this. It's hard to get to trends, but at the very least, there is this sense of even that phenomenon is increasing. And then types of firearms, and we'll get into this later with some of the sort of Bishop's policy decisions around this, but types of firearms. So handguns are involved in 53% of the 13,529 U.S. gun murders in 2023. Rifles, including what's sometimes called assault weapons, are 4%. So again, assault weapons get a lot of the buzz in the media. Handguns are really associated with the most homicides and suicides. Shotguns, 1%, type not stated, you see. And then the U.S. kind of in a global context, where are we? There was a kind of the last time someone tried to, that's a typo at the bottom, I think it should say 2018, University of Washington Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. They looked at this in 2016 and tried to sort of track death rate by firearm across multiple countries. So the U.S. was 20th in the world, but the other very well-developed countries, many of them were doing significantly better. So the U.S. gun death rate in 2016 was 10.6 per 100,000. You see Canada 2.1, Australia 1, France 2.7, Germany 0.9, Spain 0.6. The U.S. was 20th, so it wasn't the highest. Who was the highest? You'd be looking more like El Salvador, Venezuela, Guatemala, Colombia, and Honduras. And then polling on guns, and I want to pause for a moment here, just again to highlight, this is such a difficult issue. It's an issue that many people feel passionately about on both sides, and one of the ways to explain that statistically is to say, so they asked, does gun ownership make us more safe or less safe? This is from the Pew survey. 49% of adults say gun ownership does more to reduce safety by giving too many people access to firearms and increasing misuse. And 49% of U.S. adults say gun ownership does more to increase safety by allowing law-abiding citizens to protect themselves. So it's almost a perfect 50-50 split among Americans. Everyone is thinking through the issue of guns and safety, and yet it's almost an even divide. So that kind of gives you a sense of, again, why this is such a challenging issue, sort of politically especially. 58% of Americans say gun laws should be more strict. So there is a majority who would prefer more strict guns, but it's by only 58%. 26% say about right. not many, 15% say they should be less strict. About 1 in 3 Americans own a gun. Also, about 1 in 4 teachers say their school had a gun-related lockdown. So not a drill, an actual lockdown. Not necessarily a shooting, but they actually had to go through with the lockdown last year. That was a survey from 23. And more than half of gun owners do not practice safe storage. We'll come back to that. 55% of whom have children in the home. So safe storage here would be defined as keeping a gun in a safe or with a gun lock. And both youth suicide and school shootings are often associated with a gun in the home. Wall Street Journal and Washington Post looked at this. It's about 80% of school shootings, the shooter found the gun in the family home or the home of another family member or friend. So let's look now at kind of Catholic teaching to kind of come at this issue. Now we have a sense of what the facts on the ground are. Let's look at the teaching. And I want to start with the catechism. And, you know, those of you who know your catechism from the 1990s, well, you know, there's the section organized around the commandments. So we're going to go to the 5th commandment of thou shalt not kill, and we're going to kind of look at how the catechism unpacks that. And we're going to look at value of human life and peace, context of self-defense, right to use arms, and then sort of deterrence, arms race, and peace building. So first, I want to kind of suggest to you the 2 values that we're going to operate with are 1, the dignity of life, and 2, the importance of peace in society. And the Catechism lays that out for us, again, extrapolating from the 5th commandment. Human life is sacred because from its beginning, it involves the creative action of God. Earthly peace is the image and fruit of the peace of Christ, the Messianic Prince of Peace. By the blood of his cross, in his own person, he killed the hostility. He is our peace. He is declared, blessed are the peacemakers. And then this last part, that the Catechism does seem to suggest that as a result, it is right to consider regulations for firearms. So the production and sale of arms affect the common good of nations and of the international community. Hence, public authorities have the right and duty to regulate them. So that's kind of where we get at the 50,000-foot level, and then we're going to kind of go down and try to get more and more specific. And in the spirit of Lent, I need to make a confession, which is I've made a cardinal sin of PowerPoints, is I have too much text on the slides. So forgive me for that, but there's a reason I did it, because a lot of us haven't looked at this text. And so it's sometimes, I find in doing these talks, it's not, people don't always have recourse to these documents. These are our, you know, some of our most central teaching documents as Catholics. And so it's good to look at the text. So another thing, just as I said, the Catechism is going to give us, you know, we're going to get a sense of, okay, we can regulate firearms. Now, open question, what do we do about that? I want to also point out the Catechism does have self-defense, and it's copies and pastes from the Summa of St. Thomas. So if a man in self-defense uses more than necessary violence, it will be unlawful, whereas if he repels force with moderation, his defense will be lawful. So St. Thomas, super smart guy, 800 years ago, nailed self-defense law, even in modern times, that in a sense you can't bring a gun to a fist fight. It's proportional. But insofar as sometimes it's, well, do you respect a right of self-defense? We do. It is in the Catechism. But there still has to be that question of, well, what is appropriate? Thomas makes that distinction. And then on the right to use arms, as far as I know, the only time a sense of a right to use arms is in the Catechism. You'll see it is going to be, it's not really necessarily talking about an individual right to use arms. So those who legitimately hold authority also have the right to use arms to repel aggressors against the civil community entrusted to their responsibility. So there is going to be that phrase of right to use arms in that context. So now we're kind of in the section, again, we're still in Fifth Commandment land, and this is going to be sort of in the international justice side, but there are some principles here around weapons and guns that are worth teasing out. So one is, there's sort of a question, do more weapons and guns deter violence, or do they, in a sense, make violence potentially more likely? In this context, the Catechism is going to say arms do not ensure peace. Spending enormous sums to produce ever new types of weapons impedes efforts to aid needy populations. It thwarts the developments of people. I'm at the bottom here. Over-armament multiplies reasons for conflict and increases the danger of escalation. And then we're going to hop over to the compendium. They're going to expand on that even more as they kind of break down different kinds of weapons. So there's sort of nuclear weapons, there's large weapons, and then they're going to talk about small arms and light weapons. So this again would be guns. So appropriate measures are needed to control the production, sale, importation, and exportation of small arms and light weapons, armaments that facilitate many outbreaks of violence to occur. And I'm going to skip down to the red again. The position of states that apply severe controls on the international transfer of heavy arms, while they never or only very rarely restrict the sale and trafficking of small arms and light weapons, is an unacceptable contradiction. And that's because there's still violence both in a domestic context, and it also can have international ramifications with unrestricted arms trading. This is Pope Francis now, when he came in 2015 to the United States and addressed a joint session of Congress. He had this to say on the arms trade. Here we have to ask ourselves, why are deadly weapons being sold to those who plan to inflict untold suffering on individuals and society? Sadly, the answer, as we all know, is simply for money. Money that is drenched in blood, often innocent blood. In the face of this shameful and culpable silence, it is our duty to confront the problem and to stop the arms trade. So Pope Francis, not really mincing words in that address to Congress when he hits the arms trade. And then this is sort of rights to purchase or own arms. This is from the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. And this is the predecessor to what's now the Dicastery for Integral Human Development over the Vatican. It is urgent to find an effective way to stop the flow of arms to terrorist and criminal groups. An indispensable measure would be for each state to impose a strict control on the sale of handguns and small arms. Limiting the purchase of such arms would certainly not infringe upon the rights of anyone. So that's a sort of interesting snapshot from 1994 of kind of how the Vatican is thinking about rights regarding arms. Now we're going to pivot now to the USCCB. I want to kind of anticipate one of the common questions that comes up, which is around prudential judgment. What is prudential judgment? And so I'm going to invoke Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, the USCCB's voting guide that comes out in the election cycles. So I'm just going to read this section because it's going to sort of give us a sense of where we are in terms of church teaching. Prudential judgment is also needed in applying moral principles to specific policy choices in areas such as armed conflict, housing, healthcare, immigration, and others. This does not mean that all choices are equally valid, or that our guidance and that of other church leaders is just another political opinion or policy preference among many others. Rather, we urge Catholics to listen carefully to the Church's teachers when we apply Catholic social teaching to specific proposals and situations. The judgments and recommendations that we make as bishops on such specific issues do not carry the same moral authority as statements of universal moral teachings. Nevertheless, The Church's guidance on these matters is an essential resource for Catholics as they determine whether their own moral judgments are consistent with the gospel and with Catholic teaching. So sometimes it comes up in these back and forths on gun violence. Well, this is prudential judgment, and therefore it kind of goes into, well, this is, you have your prudential judgment, I have my prudential judgment. It kind of starts to sound like relativism. And the bishops here are saying, well, no, prudential judgment's not relativism. It's not dogma, but it's not relativism either. And if memory serves, I think in the Summa, St. Thomas, talking about the virtue of prudence, is he's trying to tick off, sort of, this is what prudence means. If memory serves, I think he even says, and if your bishop has pronounced on something, that should weigh on your sense of prudence. So it is, as Catholics, we must consider this. So here I'm going to start with the Bishops' Conference. This is a predecessor from the Bishops' Conference. As far as I can tell, the first time they weighed in on the topic of gun violence in a document called Handgun Violence, A Threat to Life, and it's from 1975. And again, you're going to see handguns are going to play a major role in how the bishops are thinking about that. And they're on to the statistics in terms of handguns being both what's associated with a lot of homicides. We're going to talk a little bit later about, handgun licenses, for example, have the biggest payoff in terms of reducing homicide and suicide rates. So most homicides are not the result of criminal design, but rather they are the outcomes of quarrels and arguments among spouses, friends, and acquaintances. In these situations, it is the ready availability of handguns that often leads to tragic and deadly results. So, in other words, we know this as Catholics. We live in a fallen world. Conflict is inevitable, and we all experience conflict every day of our lives. And part of the question is, how heated does that conflict get? And then, is there a weapon that someone can reach for if they're really in a state where they're of a mind to use it? It might be a short-lasting state, but is that weapon there? And this is again from the same document. Individual, state, and local action can only provide a partial solution. We must have a coherent national firearms policy responsive to the overall public interest and respectful of the rights and privileges of all Americans. And I'll note here in the same document, the bishops say, we have no problem with hunters. We acknowledge the Second Amendment. They're proposing policies that would try really just to get at the violence. The unlimited freedom to possess and use handguns must give way to the rights of all people to safety and protection against those who misuse these weapons. We call for effective and courageous action to control handguns, leading to their eventual elimination from our society. So that's a pretty stark statement in 1975. And these are some of the other policies that the bishops promoted in that document. So a several-day cooling off period, a ban on what was then Saturday night specials, registration of handguns, licensing of handgun owners, excluding juveniles, convicted felons, mentally ill. And we believe that only prohibiting the importation, manufacture, sale, possession, and use of handguns, with the exceptions we have already cited, and there were exceptions for police and military, of course, will provide a comprehensive response to handgun violence. So that's where the bishops were in 1975. So fast forward to 1990, this is a document, New Slavery, New Freedom, a pastoral message on substance abuse. And I'll mention, there are processes with the Bishops' Conference where these sorts of documents have to be reviewed and passed by the body of bishops. So it's not just sort of one bishop or one, a couple of staffers who are working on this. The widespread use of handguns and automatic weapons in connection with drug commerce reinforces our repeated call for effective and courageous action to control handguns, leading to their eventual elimination from our society. So they're copying and pasting there from the 75 document. And then in 94, again, this is from Confronting a Culture of Violence, a Catholic Framework for Action, an advocacy strategy which moves beyond the often empty rhetoric of national debate. This is what they're calling for, including curbing the easy availability of deadly weapons, They asked for advocacy. Parish and diocesan representatives and other groups can meet with media representatives to bring pressure against excessive violence and pornography. This was a document that was really trying to get at all forms of violence in our society. So gun violence is one, but there are obviously many other forms, including pornography. Legislative networks can advocate for public policies that prevent and combat crime, restrict dangerous weapons, promote safe communities, eliminate the death penalty, and help lift people out of the hellish cycle of poverty and confront the violence of abortion. So that's to Monsignor's talk of which political group do you land in. That last sentence is a beautiful example of gun violence being part of the constellation of pro-life, pro-peace teaching of the Church. And then we're in, this is the Criminal Justice Pastoral Letter from 2000, Responsibility, Rehabilitation, and Restoration. We support measures that control the sale and use of firearms and make them safer. And then we reiterate our call for sensible regulation of handguns. And then again, this is in a footnote to the same document, and I'll just say they again cite that 1975 document on handguns with the exception of police and military. The USCCB also supported the federal assault weapon ban, which ran from 1994. It expired in 2004. Some states have assault weapon bans. The federal government hasn't since 2004. And then we're fasting forward to Newtown, Connecticut. And this was a 2012 statement from the chairman of my committee, the committee I serve, the Domestic Committee, Communication, Laity, Marriage, Family Life, and Youth. So you can see control measures that control, support measures that control the sale and use of firearms, measures that make guns safer, especially efforts to prevent their unsupervised use by children and anyone other than the owner, sensible regulation of handguns, that one comes up again, support legislative efforts that seek to protect society from the violence associated with easy access to deadly weapons, including assault weapons, and make a serious commitment to confront the the pervasive role of addiction and mental illness in crime. And then there's congressional testimony. There was an effort to do some federal gun policy legislation after Newtown. It failed. So Congress actually did not pass any new laws on guns after the shooting, the Sandy Hook shooting in Newtown. But the USCCB submitted testimony to the Senate Judiciary Committee, again, reinstating support for assault weapons, child locks, universal background checks, limiting civilian access to high-capacity weapons and ammunition magazines, making gun trafficking a federal crime, improving access to mental health care, and confronting violence in media. So that was 2013. And then you kind of fast forward again. There was in 2016, there were a lot of mass shootings that summer. The USCCB had a task force in Congress. If you followed it, Congress hit a loggerhead again in the summer of 2016. The Democrats did a sit-in to kind of emphasize the point on gun violence, and that sort of just shut down the conversation. There really wasn't anything that happened in Congress after that. So Congress sort of doesn't do much for several years. We at USCCB, we started promoting. We caught wind that there was bipartisan work being done between Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator Blumenthal from Connecticut on extreme risk protection orders and universal background checks in the fall of 2019. So we were having meetings around that to sort of see what was happening. We were hearing reports from their offices. They're really getting along. Things are going very well. We're just working on the details. And then COVID hit at the beginning of 2020, and everything gets shelved. And it's COVID for a couple of years in Congress, right? But in 2022, there was the mass shooting in Uvalde in Texas at the elementary school, and and it looks like it's Sandy Hook all over again. And so there you have there's a USCCB letter. Bob Moore, thank you for bringing copies of it. It's over at the table. But there was support for a bipartisan bill, including universal background checks and extreme risk protection orders. Extreme risk protection orders, sometimes called red flag laws, they have very good evidence of supporting gun-related suicide. Anecdotally, maybe some mass shootings as well. It's harder with mass shootings to get a large data set. But that's, so that passed. That was the first federal gun legislation to pass Congress in almost 30 years. And that, again, demonstrates how difficult an issue this is politically, to that first point of, America's basically a 50-50 split on guns make us safer or less safe. And I neglected to mention also the USCCB filed an amicus brief in the Rahimi case. That was a domestic violence case where the question was whether a statute allowing for a protective order to remove guns from someone in a domestic violence situation violated the Second Amendment. It did not. It did not. So, so this kind of brings us back to the very beginning. This is sort of the summary of the things I've gone through, but it hopefully gives you a sense of how did we get here, how did these policies build over time, and then what are the Catholic teaching, both the high principles of dignity of life, peace, and society, and then where are they located in Catholic teaching documents that sort of support these various policies. I want to talk, as I'm kind of winding down here, a little bit about other ways to help. So there are other interventions that don't require a government to agree with you, because it's hard if you're always trying to lobby either a state or a federal government to change policy. You may not have opportunities for years, depending on kind of the politics of the legislature that you're dealing with. But there are other ways to do interventions that can lower violence and lower gun violence. One of them is place-based intervention. There's good research that reclaiming vacant lots and rehabilitating abandoned buildings, so think like urban gardens, and these things have shown a real ability to lower violence in the surrounding neighborhood. And it can be an opportunity for Catholic groups or other civil society or nonprofit groups to usually work with the local municipality. Sometimes there are grants that can be had, and then you can, and essentially you can claim your territory. You say, Saint so-and-so's parish is helping out, kill two birds with one stone. You can make it about Laudato Si too, and ecology. So but there is solid evidence that this plays a factor, particularly in urban environments. The second is education on safe storage. So as I mentioned, it's less than 50% of gun owners, according to the surveys, that practice safe storage, so unloaded in a safe or with a gun lock. And safes and gun locks have gotten pretty sophisticated. So, it's kind of like, remember when the cell phones, they all had the thumbprint and you could open it. It was really quick. There are a lot of gun safes that can do that. So it can still be under lock. Only the owner can get to the guns, but it can be, in an emergency, it can be accessed. Safe storage, so there are laws on safe storage and there is, of course, a deterrence factor of a criminal penalty for not practicing safe storage. Unfortunately, the only time that that's really going to be enforced is after a horrible tragedy has happened. And sometimes people think, well, I don't want to punish, the parents here. They've already essentially lost their child if their child went and committed a mass shooting or school shooting. It happened, I think, last year after one of the mass shootings in Michigan. And that there were facts in that case where the parents had really ignored some flagrant red flags, and there was outrage about that. But that's, to my knowledge, that doesn't happen very often. That was one of the few times that's happened. So there's, in a sense, being proactive about it is, certainly the police are not going to go and check on guns, but there can be proactive education about the effect, specifically the connection of school shootings and youth suicides. There was some data from a study a couple years ago that suggested that people who are police and military may be particularly effective messengers on this. There was a pilot study where people's physicians ask them, do you own a gun in your house? Can I tell you about safety? And gun owners tended not to like their physician asking that question and being kind of the messenger. But there was a suggestion that people who use firearms professionally, who can sort of come in and say, I have professional training about firearm safety. Let me tell you if you're a gun owner. And so it's something I've always thought, it could be something to explore in a parish setting if the pastor knows someone in law enforcement or military who'd be willing on a Thursday night, to sort of say, let me talk, to the gun owners around just about the training I've received, and this is the way to, to practice safety for your family and the community and the schools. And then lastly, Catholic schools. There's good data that Catholic schools can lower violence in the neighborhood, especially in urban settings. There's a book called Lost Classroom, Lost Community. Nicole Garnett at Notre Dame, it might be U Chicago Press, but they did some research in Chicago and some other places to look at the effect of Catholic schools. Catholic schools, of course, are so amazing at binding together relationships in the community, and that sort of social capital that Catholic schools can build up can also be a safety issue, can help with the safety of a community. And so additional links, the backgrounder, and which I think is also down there. Also, if you want kind of this laid out in a narrative form, Bishop Frank Duane of Venice, Florida, when he was the chairman of the Domestic Committee, addressed the full body of bishops in the fall of 2019, responses to the plague of gun violence. That's also online. It's got good data, it's good footnotes, but also it kind of lays it out, ties it to Scripture, ties it to our sense of going out to people who are isolated, who are feeling like they don't belong, and trying to include, trying to have a sense of pain of everybody involved in this. I want to close on two. How am I doing on time? Man, 3 minutes. So this is about as good as I could have expected. So I want to close on two brief comments on Pope Francis's last two encyclicals, Fratelli Tutti and Dilexit Nos, because I really want to end on this notion of this is a politically challenging issue. You might be feeling different ways or sensibilities after this presentation. That's okay. What do we have from Fratelli Tutti? Well, Pope Francis really talks in Fratelli Tutti is an encyclical about politics, and particularly about political division and political polarization. And the divisions are in a sense, the threat to the common good. As Catholics, our goal is dignity of life and common good. That's sort of the quickest way I can summarize Catholic social teaching. If you have stark political division, if the common good is supposed to be the good of all with nobody excluded, then sharp political divisions are a real obstacle to that. And Fratelli Tutti essentially offers a number of perspectives on this, but if one that I really want to hone in on is dialogue. Dialogue. And Francis says this is the essential path, dialogue. Dialogue is not debate. It's not about winning and losing arguments. It's not about power politics. It's not about we win and they lose. In fact, dialogue is kind of a way of the cross. Francis has a great passage where he talks about if you're doing dialogue right, in a sense you're suffering. You may be shifting around in your chair, you're blushing, you're sweating, you're biting your tongue. A lot of Americans have this experience at Thanksgiving dinner. But what does dialogue really mean? If you look at the other social encyclicals, he didn't invent dialogue. A lot of the popes up to Francis said, and what we do about this as Catholics is dialogue. They assumed that we all knew what dialogue meant. I think Pope Francis realized we need to talk more about dialogue. Think about the root, dia logos. Logos, you're hearing the word from the other person, this other person who's created in the image and likeness of God, who may not agree with you on a really important issue, maybe an issue where lives are at stake. We still have to dialogue. He puts it, indifference is over here. We can't be indifferent as Catholics. Violence is over here. We're not called to that either. We're called to dialogue. And then last, and I'll close on Dilexit Nos. Dilexit Nos, Pope Francis's last encyclical on the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And you may think, well, that's not a social encyclical. That's a sort of classic Catholic devotional. It is, but I really commend it to you. In the final concluding section, Francis says right out, if you have that encounter with the Sacred Heart of Jesus, then you can understand the social teachings, like the social teachings in Laudato Si, like Fratelli Tutti. So he's, in a sense, some folks said, well, has Francis announced new doctrine? Laudato Si is a watershed of much more detail of Catholic teaching around ecology than had been before. It had been before. Pope Benedict was sometimes nicknamed the Green Pope, but there was a lot more detail in Laudato Si. Fratelli Tutti, he's not announcing new doctrine, but in a sense he's reframing. He's saying as Catholics, it's not just the what. It's not just that we have a multiple choice test and we have to get the right answer. What does the church teach? It's the how. It's the how. It's kind of like, if you play golf and you know that the ball needs to go in the hole, well, that's great. That you do need to know that. But if your golf swing is a mess, you're not going to get the ball in the hole. And Fratelli Tutti is about the swing. It is about the how. And then Dilexit Nos is about that deep foundation. That deep foundation is the heart of Christ. And you can see that he stands in that tradition with Bernard of Clairvaux and St. Bonaventure and John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, and folks who would sort of point out conversion starts in the heart. It gets to the mind. The mind is very important, but conversion starts in the heart. And there are challenges that if they remain just intellectual debates, they won't take us as far as love can take us. So anyway, I want to stop there and thank you again. Thank you for all the work you're doing, because I know there are a lot of ministries represented in this room that help build up peace and the dignity of life. Thank you for coming out on a Saturday evening. Thank you for your kind attention. It's been a pleasure to be with you, and now I'm happy to take some questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Michael, for all the research that you've done and your work with the bishops in advocating for gun reform. Thanks for updating us on our Catholic magisterial teaching, the foundational principles for what we do. We do now have time for question and answers. And Allison Fram, who is the Director of Young Adult, Family, and Social Action Ministry here at Nativity, will be our facilitator. Thank you, Allison. Okay, and we will, you'll be able to text your questions, and we'll try to respond to as many of them as we can.
Thank you. Coming out from behind the curtain there. Good to be with you all today, and I'm happy to give voice to your questions to Michael. And our first question, Michael, is, wouldn't it be safer to arm law-abiding citizens so they can protect themselves rather than legislate restrictions that will get guns out of the hands of these citizens? Well, start with an easy one.
Sure. Okay. I think maybe two parts to that answer. One is a lot of the proposals that you saw that the bishops have adopted would not take guns out of the hands of law-abiding citizens. So that's sort of point number one. And then point number two is we do have this, there is some research about sort of unrestricted common carry and that being associated with an uptick in violence. But also we have this tradition as Catholics of supporting law enforcement and kind of the role that law enforcement plays with the community. So St. Thomas, invoking again, not a fan of vigilantes. I sometimes say, I don't think St. Thomas would like Batman because he really does believe in that sort of the way that the community works with authorities to support the law, and that is in furtherance of justice.
Thank you. Our second question. Seatbelt laws were put into place to protect life. Why is it difficult to do the same with gun reform? Is it because it has the word gun in it?
Yeah, I think it goes back to that earlier polling on Americans are really split on the central issue of what is it that makes us safer. And so that's why I think the only recourse we have is dialogue, to listen to each other, to try to hear what the other person is saying. I think that's the reason. There's not, I guess I don't know the latest polling, but my guess is there would not be as much of a split on do seatbelts make us safer. Most people would agree that they do. But guns are a tricky one for that reason, and so that's why dialogue and education and trying to inform yourself of facts and also as a Catholic, what the church teaches, what your bishops and your pastors are talking about is really important.
Okay. Our next question is, if 70+ million Catholics were encouraged to advocate for gun safety, there might be progress in resolving the violence perpetrated through guns. What can we do to encourage advocacy in the Commonwealth and in the U.S.?
That's a great question. Well, a shameless plug is, you can always sign up for the USCCB action alerts. But, and also you have a wonderful state Catholic conference here in Virginia, and you can work with them too. And there are really dedicated people who are trying to track these issues, thinking with the church, thinking with Catholic teaching as well. And obviously there are many other organizations in this space, and Catholics can explore those. I mean, to some extent, I would say many Catholic organizations are doing exactly that. And so, insofar as you can lift up those messages, it's always easier to do things with other people than to do it by yourself. So to try to find people to collaborate with is a great start.
Thank you for that response. This next question is, what are countries that have low gun deaths doing that we are not?
That's a very good question. I mean, and I don't have this off the top of my head. In some countries, there are greater restrictions on guns, or it's, I want to say in Japan, like it takes like 6 months to get clearance to get a gun. So in some countries, that's the case. In some countries, there are different cultural factors as well. So I think it's a combination of things, but certainly gun policy, one could certainly track different gun policies. The same is true with state policies. You saw in the slide, there's a variance among the states, and there's a variance, of state policies. So for example, something as sort of straightforward as large capacity magazines, so a gun magazine that has 10 or more bullets, some places it's defined as 15 or more bullets. A state level restriction on large capacity magazines is associated with fewer mass shootings, or when there is a mass shooting, fewer casualties. I take the example of the Dayton, Ohio shooter from a few years ago. He went to kind of downtown Dayton, sort of the entertainment district, lots of bars, lots of people out on a weekend, and started shooting. And the Dayton police had an amazing response time. He was, I think within 60 or 90 seconds, he's down. So every police officer in Dayton who was involved in that should get a medal, because they had just a perfect response time. But he still managed to get off I think over 100 bullets, and he injured and killed many, many people. Why? Because he had a drum of 100 bullets that was just feeding right in. So if one can kind of do the restriction on the magazine, that can make a difference. And you sort of say, well, you can just go to one state over. This happens. For example, the District of Columbia has very strict gun laws. People go to West Virginia. Illinois has very strict gun laws. They go to Wisconsin or somewhere else. Chicago, the gun violence in Chicago, the guns often come from out of state. So that's true, and yet in the aggregate, these things at the state level do seem to have some positive results. So that's kind of what you have to look at with these things, is you're not going to get a perfect zeroing out, but in the aggregate, these policies, several of these policies are shown to be helpful. And part of it is trying to be smart with looking at the data. not every gun policy is shown in the data to have a large effect on homicides and suicides. Some of them more than others, but in the aggregate, they do have an effect.
Thank you. Here's our next question. How can the church connect the dots more often on the violence of abortion and gun violence, war, death penalty? Shouldn't we be consistent and loud if we believe in the dignity of human life?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are consistent. That's sort of my, as you saw in that statement, you know, at least I'll speak now just sort of the bishops' conference. You know, there is an attempt really to show, as I said, dignity of life and the common good. Those are sort of the two pillars of Catholic social teaching, and to show that seamlessness. And you know, the pro-life office and my office are down the hall from each other, and we try to talk and we try to work together whenever we can when we have cross-cutting issues. You know, I would say though it is part of that call as Catholics in engaging in Fratelli Tutti to be courageous. To as Monsignor again in his wonderful homily sort of pointed out, we have issues that are going to fall into different camps. And so for us to be consistent as Catholics, it does come at a cost. I mean, it means that you have to be willing to put your faith ahead of, for example, your party. That's a hard thing to do. That requires some sacrifice. It might mean giving up a little bit of power. But I would invoke Mother Teresa there of it, you know, it's, to paraphrase, you know, it's more important to be faithful than to be successful. And that witness of faith, now I'm going to talk about it in the other way. In Washington, the USCCB is sort of a very strange organization because we don't fall into a partisan bucket, because we really are nonpartisan. And Capitol Hill takes notice. You know, when we write to Capitol Hill and we try to analyze something through the whole lens of Catholic teaching, it kind of, for Democrats and Republicans, it's sort of, what are they doing? But that can actually, that is really a service to politicians and to the political parties, because there have been occasions where that really helps foster bipartisan compromise on important issues so that the USCCB and Catholics generally can show a different way, can show a way that's not beholden to either party, but is really trying to stay consistent with the logic of the dignity of life and the common good.
Thank you, Michael. Our next question, how do we reconcile USCCB support for actions to curb gun violence with Second Amendment restrictions on gun laws? Some of those proposals don't seem likely to hold up in court. Are there more realistic actions to take?
So I would say, on the one hand, several of those proposals have held up in court. So the assault weapon ban was challenged in court, that held up, and a number of others have as well. I think probably to the extent that the bishops were saying, you know, we would potentially support a ban on handguns, that probably would not hold up in court now after the DC versus Heller case. But I'd point out that, you know, at the time, academics were somewhat surprised at DC versus Heller. That may not have been you know, that position may not have been outside of kind of what people were expecting in the 1990s or the 1970s when the bishops were taking that position. So I do think that overall those positions comport with the Second Amendment and with the laws of our country. They can be done at the state level. Often there's more action at the state level than the federal level. The federal level politics are really, really polarized. So any polarizing issue, it's really, really hard at the federal level, and it has been for many years, not just now. State politics, sometimes there's a little more of an opportunity to try to sort of stick to, this is how this is affecting people on a day-to-day basis, let's try to get a coalition. And then, you know, as we pointed out, there's other means of intervention that don't necessarily involve the government. And obviously, you know, start with prayer. Start there. That has to be where everything starts, and then get together with people who want to work with you, and then try to get together with some people who might disagree with you, and kind of go from there. And there's that old Franciscan phrase of first start with what you must do, then do what's possible, and soon you'll be finding yourself doing the impossible. So start with what works locally. Subsidiarity is your friend, and you can build from there.
I like that very practical advice there. Thanks, Michael. This next one's kind of a big picture question. Do you see any likelihood of additional federal gun legislation in the near future?
I would say probably not in the very near future. There's a lot, there are some major legislative pieces that Congress is looking at right now that's taking up most of the energy of Congress. Unfortunately, the way that it has gone is it's only the times we've come closest in the last 15 years to passing federal gun legislation is really only if there's a mass shooting at an elementary school. And even there was not legislation after Sandy Hook, only after Uvalde. So it doesn't mean, there are some proposals on the table. We'll be looking at them at the USCCB. There are good proposals. And I guess I would also say this: even if it's the case that one could sort of say in a realpolitik sense of, well, this probably isn't going to happen right now at the federal level. The Uvalde example is sort of illustrative that sometimes laying the groundwork for this stuff pays dividends years later. So it really, those policies that we and a number of groups were in conversations on, with Senator Graham and Senator Blumenthal's offices, even though those ended up getting scuttled in 2020 with COVID, they were there. The foundation had been laid so that when Uvalde happened, when the politics to do something became acute, there was a bipartisan policy that had been investigated, that they had really tried to work through, that was on the shelf that they could go and get. And I think that's the other really important thing is working in a bipartisan manner. We really try to do that at the USCCB. One of the things, as issues get more polarized, if you're a single party issue, sometimes you feel like you're a zero party issue, because if one party knows that you're beholden to them on that issue, then if the power dynamics change and the politics change, they kind of know you don't have anywhere else to go. So it's really important, to the extent it's possible. Sometimes it feels like it's not possible, but it's really important to the extent it's possible on this issue and all the other polarized ones to try to build bipartisan consensus, because that's the only thing that's going to endure. Politics will change, so sometimes we use the phrase politically durable. You want a politically durable policy, and that really means bipartisan. And also, if you're thinking as a Catholic of the common good, this is really something for everybody that excludes no one. Well, it would be sensible that should be something that could support a bipartisan consensus and take into account all those different viewpoints.
Okay. This next question is more about how this topic relates to maybe individual families. It says, how can a Catholic reconcile their espoused or reasonable duty of defense to themselves and family and the bishop's call to remove handguns and small arms?
Sure. Well, as I said, self-defense is in the Catechism, so I think that's a prudential judgment for a Catholic. I think certainly it would be. I think the bishop's recommendations would certainly recommend safe storage where a Catholic a gun owner, and we know it's 1 in 3 Americans are gun owners. There are many Catholic gun owners. The vast majority of gun owners are law-abiding citizens, do not hurt other people, are upstanding members of their communities. So this is not against gun ownership writ large. I think, one thing, prudential judgment in a church context also means that context matters. So just to give a practical example, I've only seen a shooting once. I was in Harvard Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I was walking. I'd come out of a class, and it was late at night, and I walking by a bar, and there are two guys in front of the bar who are struggling over a handgun. And so I kind of duck around the corner, and I have a cell phone. I pull it out. I call 911. While I'm on the call with the 911 operator, 3 police cruisers pull up to that bar. Cambridge is a urban area, densely populated area, high police. Their police cruisers are always floating around, especially on a Saturday night. So they're going to get there real fast. If somebody says, "Hey, there's a gun, there's going to be shooting," they're going to be right there. My in-laws live in rural Colorado, western Colorado. I think their estimated police time is like 20 to 40 minutes. They're not really sure, but that's going to be way different from Harvard Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They own guns. They're in a safe. So I think that's, if it is a matter of conscience, with all matter of consciences, not a bad idea to talk to a priest about it if you're on the fence. But I think context matters, and I think, again, trying to make good judgments matters.
Thank you. Here's our next question. Why so much focus on assault weapons bans and magazines restrictions? Based on your statistics, it seems focusing on suicide prevention, safe storage, poverty, and other efforts would have a far greater impact.
So it's true that there are different impacts for different policies. The assault weapons ban, I will say there is some mixed statistics on how effective that federal ban was. It is true that it's hard to define what an assault weapon is, whether it's automatic, semi-automatic. Automatic weapons are actually very highly regulated. Large capacity magazines, though, there was a study in, I want to say 2019 from Harvard and Columbia, which did find some good statistical differences in mass shootings. So because gun violence, there's so many different issues you're trying to get at, it involves different policy solutions, and it involves trying to follow, in a sense, follow the data, because, I'll say this about mental health. So that's also one that's often comes out, especially after a mass shooting. So the statistics are, after a gun, the CDC tracks after gun-related homicides and suicides, is there a known mental health issue? In gun-related suicides, it's more than half. There's a known mental health issue before the suicide. In gun-related homicides, I think, I'm trying to remember the year, so this might not be the most recent year, but it was something like 4%. 4%. So in other words, most gun-related homicides, there's not a known mental health issue. There, anecdotally, in a lot of mass shootings, it seems that could be the case, but it's really important. The USCCB is actually has been undertaking a mental health campaign for the last few years, and it's really important to note. I don't have the statistic off the top of my head. A very large number of Americans have some form of mental health or mental illness each year, and over longitudinal studies that take place over decades, it is normal to experience a mental health or mental illness issue. Just like it's normal to be physically ill, you would be abnormal if you never experienced a mental health issue. And so most people experiencing mental health are really no more dangerous than the general population. So it's important not to stigmatize people with mental health or mental illness issues as being especially prone to violence. On the other hand, in the context of suicide, it is really important to try to get mental health services. As we all know, there's just a terrible math problem. Anyone who's tried to get in touch with a mental health therapist or a counselor, or if someone has needed inpatient treatment for mental health, it is so hard to get a bed in a hospital for this. This is a huge, huge resource problem. And with suicidal crises are usually a limited period of time, maybe a series of weeks or months. So there's really, this was where extreme risk protection orders comes in. There's good data that if guns can be removed from someone in a suicidal crisis, even if they attempt suicide by other means, suicide attempt by gun is a roughly 90% success rate. If you shoot yourself in the head, there's not a lot that EMTs can do. Suicide by other means, the most popular other means are overdosing on pills or slitting wrists. EMTs are amazing. Our emergency rooms are amazing at helping people in those situations. And so the survival rate is roughly 90% of other suicide not by gun. So, so kind of diving into that, I think, to go to the questioner's first point, it is sort of the Catholic both and. What we're trying to do is save lives. And whether that's saving a life from a potential homicide or a potential suicide. But it is very important to look at the policies, because it does limit credibility if one kind of holds out a policy, this is the policy we're all behind, and then the statistics show maybe it's a mix, or it's not. There are others that are more effective, that maybe that gun owners would be, or those who resist gun policies would be, more would find more agreeable. So it is important to navigate those things, but again, keeping those twin goals, peace and dignity of life, in all these different contexts.
Thank you for that perspective, Michael. Our next question's, I think, very interesting. El Salvador, Honduras, and Venezuela, and some other nations mentioned, have incredibly strict gun control laws, much more so than American laws, yet their violence continues to climb in most cases, with the notable exception of El Salvador. How can you reconcile these policies and the data from these nations?
Yeah, so I think, hopefully I acknowledge that the gun policies aren't everything, and yet if you look at the examples, whether it's state by state, I mean, the handgun license I didn't mention, but usually the case examples are, I believe it's Connecticut and Missouri. And Connecticut put in a handgun license, noticed a major double-digit drop in homicide and suicide rates. They did not go up by other means. Missouri had a handgun license from like the early 1900s, and sort of 90 years later, they got rid of it. They experienced a precipitous rise in both homicides and suicides related to guns. So there are case studies that show that these policies have effectiveness. That's not going to mean that they're perfectly effective, and because this is such a complex system, there are going to be other factors: politics, culture, organized crime. The bishops have mentioned, connections to drug trafficking. We know as Catholics, there were some studies showing alcohol and substance abuse and the correlation with some, I think like a third of homicides. Correlation doesn't show causation, but we know from kind of our own theology of capital sins, these are the sins that lead to other sins. So working on anger and wrath, these have consequences, but there's no, I certainly would acknowledge the context can change, and that's why it's important to kind of keep looking at this, keep looking at the data. You're the expert on your own community, and then try to find good reliable sources of data for national data. I think it's especially helpful to find sources of data that will draw that distinction between here are the proposed gun policies that really do have empirical evidence that show that they'll be supported, and here are the ones that might be more politically popular, but they may not have quite as good evidence from the studies that this will be successful. That'll give credibility, and that'll make dialogue much more possible.
This is our last question for you.
Okay.
And on this topic that you're here to speak about tonight, what gives you hope in this area?
What gives me hope in this area? I mean, our hope is in the Lord, first of all. That's Catholic school gave me an easy answer on that one. It is certainly hopeful to see all of you and to see this room as full as it is. It's hopeful when we do things like the Catholic Social Ministry Gathering, we have so many young people. I think there are statistics, and again, I don't have them off the top of my head. Gun violence really affects so many people. When you think about the number of homicides each year, this isn't so hopeful, but it is just that it's not an isolated incident, especially when combined with suicides, that it's just becoming more of a universal phenomenon, and so it's easier to talk about. It's not as abstract. So that gives me some hope for the possibility of kind of more common sense dialogue around it. But really, my hope, as I ended, is Dilexit Nos. You know, insofar as we are all on, daily on a path of conversion, and all of us have an element of Catholic teaching or elements that challenge us. You know, a good homily I heard was just let those elements challenge you. Let them challenge you. Go deeper on them. That's a common Catholic experience for us all. But I think the hope is that, the Sacred Heart of Jesus is the love that we are offered as Christians, as Catholics, is so profound that is so worth hoping in. And our political problems, and there are so many right now, that's where to place hope. That is a good, firm foundation. That's a good anchor for the soul. And then, as Jesus, I think, would commend us all, go out and be with others, pray with others, work with others, walk humbly with God. We have lots and lots of reasons for hope.
Thank you for receiving these questions, Michael, for your very thoughtful responses. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Allison, for facilitating our question and answer time with Michael. And Michael, thank you so much for leading the dialogue tonight in the conversation. I find hope in the very fact that our church cares about this issue, and our bishop does, and that the Virginia Catholic Conference supported 2 gun reform bills this past year in our state of Virginia. One was to ban assault weapons. The second was proposed by the Bon Secours Catholic hospital system to not allow weapons into hospitals except for security personnel. Both of those bills actually passed the General Assembly with bipartisan support, and they're sitting on the governor's desk. And Emily Jackson from Virginia Catholic Conference has provided materials for us that we could advocate for the governor to sign those bills. In the United States, we love our freedom, right? It's the Second Amendment, and we love our freedom. But we also love our kids. We love our children. So I find hope in that as a state or as a country, we will keep working at this because we don't want guns to kill our kids. And right now, it's the leading cause of death among our children and our teenagers. So, I find great hope in this gathering, and that we can continue to advocate locally. It seemed to me also that the decisions we make in our homes are important. The bishop had provided for all the priests and our school administrators a workshop on suicide prevention this past year. And one of the statistics that struck me was that 90% of all suicide attempts using guns is successful. And of all the other methods of suicide, they're only 30% successful. So if someone who is in a crisis and in a darkness and in a despair is looking to if they don't have access to a gun, it could really save lives, a lot of lives. And for those who do have guns, just securing them and locking them in their homes saves a lot of lives. So there's things that we can do, I think, personally, among our own families and our own friends. Michael, thanks for the work you do with the Bishops' Conference on this issue and many other justice issues. We were so blessed to have you come tonight. And I'm going to invite Bishop Burbidge now to come forward for closing remarks and the final blessing. And Bishop, thank you for being with us tonight for Mass, but also for this conference and your support of justice. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Monsignor Bob, again for your beautiful homily at Mass tonight. Thanks to you and everyone here at Nativity for the gracious welcome and for everyone who organized so many details with an event like this. So very grateful to all of you. I have hope in the Bishops' Conference because we have people like Michael working at the conference. We are very blessed that there are so many lay faithful working at the Bishops' Conference who are extremely, as he is, experienced, gifted, talented, educated, who choose to give their life in service to the church. And we are very blessed, Michael, by your service in a very particular way. Thank you very much. A lot of the work of the Bishops' Conference is often done behind the scenes. But every day, our elected bishops' leadership team, as well as the directors of the various offices, are engaging. They're engaging with elected officials and their staffs. They're trying to form those relationships, to create those settings where the voice of the church, the voice of the bishops can be heard. And many times you don't hear about that. It's behind the scenes, but it's happening every day. And I always want to assure the faithful that maybe you don't see a result that you would like to see or think that anything's being done on a certain issue, but it is. And many times it's behind the scenes praying God it's going to lead to the results that we ultimately want to encounter. The Peace and Justice Commission of the Diocese of Arlington is a great gift to this diocese that we are willing each year to talk about the moral issues that are confronting us and challenging us. But what really pleases me about the Peace and Justice Commission and the work they do, it's always, as you saw tonight, it's always centered around the sacredness of human life. The fact that we're all created in God's image and likeness. The work of the Peace and Justice Commission is always about the dignity of the human person, that we are children of God, and that's where our dignity surfaces. And it's always the work of this conference to call us to imitate Jesus. No matter what the issue is, we find the right path if we are following the ways of the Lord and imitating him. So I am always pleased, and Father Monsignor Bob mentioned the different topics we've covered over the years, but it's always under this umbrella, under the umbrella of the gospel of life, the mandate that we are called to follow. The bishops, you hear a lot about the Bishops' Conference and the bishops' statements and things like that. And just an insight, we see ourselves as pastors. We don't see ourselves as politicians. We're pastoral leaders. And as bishops, we are called as individuals in our diocese and as the Conference of Bishops to work together to bring and teach the truth in love and to bring that voice to the public arena, and especially to our elected officials who are entrusted with finding ways to get that truth into laws that are right and true and good and pure and just. But that policy, that work of getting that done, that is up to those we elect. And so it is important, as we did at Mass tonight, to pray for our elected officials, all of them, that they will be given the wisdom and the grace and the enlightenment of the Lord. And to do, as we heard this evening, to do our part to let them hear our voices. So I'm going to add another plug to getting those action alerts from USCCB and the Virginia Catholic Conference. As I say every time this year, we are told that every email, every text, every phone call, every letter is counted. They all make a difference. And so we can do our part to bring our faith to the elected officials and pray that they have the grace to do what is right and good and to act justly. So please continue to let your voices be heard. Another issue that we heard about tonight on various levels is the mental health issue, which is of grave concern, I know, for all of us. And we're seeing mental health issues, and as Michael mentioned, all of us in some way deal with emotional issues and things that affect us on that level. All of us in our families know those who are dealing with mental health issues, and some in a more serious way than others, and some dealing with mental health issues that paralyze them and cause great distress to those who love them. We are very blessed in our diocese. I've formed a mental health council because we have expertise in this diocese. A lot of lay faithful who have willing to come together as a body headed by my Vicar General, Father Workman, to help me to share their expertise on what can we do as a church, not just pastorally, but also practically to help alleviate this suffering. And I'm pleased to report that this council is making great progress, and I'll be keeping you all informed of how the diocese will be at the center of, sadly, the mental health crisis that we are all facing. So please keep that special intention in your prayers. Your presence here tonight is a sign of hope as well. It's a sign that you take your faith seriously. You want to be informed. And we have to be informed if we're going to inspire. And the fact that you allow time tonight to be informed, to learn, is really a sign of hope for me. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for your faithful witness. We talked a lot about data tonight, a lot about statistics, but as we heard in Michael's talk and in his voice, what we were really gathered us tonight is persons, individuals we know who have lost their lives because of gun violence, families who are suffering because of that, and those we worry about, who may not be protected. So tonight in our prayer, I hope we remember all those individuals and pray through the help of Mary, the Queen of Peace, that all gun violence and all violence throughout our country and world will be eradicated so that we can truly know the peace that only Christ can give. So how about if we make that our closing prayer? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Let us turn to Mary, Queen of Peace. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Mary, Mother of the Church. And dear friends, may Almighty God bless you and your loved ones with abundant spiritual gifts throughout this sacred season. May he renew you in body and soul and spirit and lead you ever closer to him. May the Lord keep you safe in your travels home this evening. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you.